kick stuff back and forth, right?
Right.
We're you and I are the grown-ups in the room, you know, and even though we're a different generation, man. But here you go. I really have been exploring this Canadian versus American like you have.
Yeah.
For decades.
That was the basis of the show when I started it.
Sure. And I talk to people around the world, but I was talking to East Coast businessman, Canadian businessman out of Montreal, as a matter of fact. English guy, but he's out of Montreal, and I was talking about this. I said, are Canadians really nicer than Americans? Or let's talk about the business world. Are Canadian business people nicer than American business people? And in fairness, I think there's a throwback. I think we're all living 30, 40 years behind the times, because there were different times in both countries where there was much more politeness and pragmatism. But talking about 2022, I asked him this, and he had said, don't tell Canadians that they're perfect. Okay, a Canadian businessman. This is a guy he's a Canadian businessman, but most of his, about 80% of his clients are American. Okay, so he knows the business world, both sides. And he said the difference between Canadian businessmen and American businessmen. Say what you will about American businessmen, they're clear and decisive. You finish a meeting and there's a plan of action. There really is. I've put on 100 of those meetings, Mike. But he said, when you sit around with Canadian business people, and this is, again, I'm sure not stereotyping across the board, but you sit with Canadian business people, and he's done like these high-end presentations selling multi-million dollars of product, right, to government entities or corporate entities. And he's sitting there, and he says, you'll sit there with the 6, 7, 8 Canadian guys in the boardroom, and you'll do the best sales presentation you've ever done in your life. You know that they're really begging, needing your product. Like it's a no-brainer. It's one of those no-brainers, like we say in the States. And he says the Canadian business people will not make a decision. They'll say, cool, thanks very much for your presentation. It was really good. We're going to chat. We're going to chat about it a little bit. And why don't we get together at some future time? And again, I don't know if that's a stereotype, but I think it might be, Mike.
I was thinking while you were talking, I think the reason for that, though, is because there's so much more restrictions on business in Canada. And there's so much more regulations. There's so much more taxation. There's so much more red tape. So, I mean, they have to be a little bit more reserved in a decision, whereas a counterpart in a freer state can just go with it.
Oh, big time. I have to be reminded of that, Mike, of the regulation up there.
Yeah.
And it goes back decades. I can't even imagine now. There's a law for a law for a law. I remember my uncle back in Montreal, and this is not too long ago. It was maybe the 90s, maybe the early 2000s. And he owned a beautiful duplex just outside of Montreal. But I said, Uncle Norman, why aren't you renting the upstairs? Beautiful 3-bedroom, 2-bath rental, right, Mike? I mean, 8 miles out of Montreal. And he said, oh, Greggy, I wouldn't rent it for $1 million because they're under the landlord-tenant restrictions. And he said, with 3 bedrooms, I will always get families. And I choose based on this property. I don't want a bunch of kids in my rental. It's just, and you can do that down in the States, right? You got 55 and older down here, whatever. It's common sense. But I said, are you telling me that you're losing X dollars per month? I can even wager that's probably a $2,000 rental now. I don't know what the price is, but it's a big time. I said, you mean you're going without any revenue, Uncle Norman, so that you don't have to deal with the province of Quebec landlord regulations?
Yeah.
Something's wrong. Then the quick answer conclusion to folks in Alberta 51. That's the answer. Create your own regulations. End of story. Constitution, province of Alberta, new state of Alberta. End of story. Do what you want. I couldn't dream opening up a business in Canada now, especially like Quebec,
I have run businesses in Canada, and it's like it's so difficult to get things off the ground. The rules are stacked against you. Look, this is and when Canada does things like this, they're literally shooting themselves in the foot over and over again. With the amount of natural resources that are available right under people's feet in Canada, I'm talking forestry, agriculture, mining, oil and gas. Like, Canada could be an economic power.